Hello, and welcome to Torty Talks. The following is a story about my tortoise. I hope you enjoy them. This is the story of tortoises. After having owned my first pet, a hamster called Hammy, because we're very clever at thinking up names, came across the Blue Peter option of having a tortoise, which they called Frida. Fred initially, but then somebody managed to find out that it was in fact female, and so renamed it Frida. We, on the other hand, got a tortoise. This was when I was a very small youth, slightly bigger than when I was the owner of the hamster, noticeably larger than when I was a poor person who had to live with the cat, Spike. But the tortoise, the first one we had, I think, was also named Fred. Did not hang around long. In fact, I can't remember what happened, except that I liked Fred. Well, I liked the concept tortoise. A sort of an uncaring creature that didn't require anything at all much. Probably required more than we gave it, because it died, or vanished. But whatever it happened, I was unaware of, and probably I was protected from it, as I didn't stumble across the poor dead being as I had the hamster Hammy. Anyway, in later life, I came across a tortoise in a pet shop in Ealing, which is where we lived, which is probably why I came across the pet shop. And we went in, and there it was, and we thought, cool, that's a nice-looking tortoise. Let's buy this tortoise, which we did. And we brought it home, and we came up with a better name than Fred or Frida or anything else. We called her Jess. And Jess was a very interesting tortoise. She was quite large when we bought her, bigger than the average small tortoise from a pet shop. And she had, I seem to remember, it looked as if the bottom of her shell had been biffed in some way or other. Didn't seem to be suffering at all from it, or I don't know how you can tell if a tortoise has suffered some form of unpleasantness in past life, or we couldn't tell how old she was either. But you could count the rings on the shells. They radiate outwards. And there were something like 30 or 40 of those. But maybe that was her age. The dent in her base of her shell was undateable. She sat in our garden and ate things. Not the sorts of things that you would normally expect a tortoise to eat. Because she bit my sister's toe and drew blood, which was a fairly unexpected thing for a what we assume to be vegetarian tortoise to do. But she did that. She also ate a large number of fruit, because we had quite a number of trees in that garden, and we didn't spend a great deal of time picking them or spraying them. So rather insect-attacked fruits and rotted stuff fell to the ground to the height of said tortoise, who ate them and enjoyed them a lot. Wasn't particularly fond of lettuce, if I remember correctly. Cucumber was shunned. Bits of, that red stuff, what is it? Yes, tomato was quite happily consumed, as were strawberries. We didn't grow any of those, probably because she ate them very rapidly. Another rapid thing she was capable of doing was avoiding having a photograph taken. Now, rapidity in tortoises are sort of oxymoronically linked. I had her in the perfect photographic position between my feet one day, and I had a camera in my hands standing directly above her, and I took a photograph. In that photograph, you can see my feet. and a brown smear where the tortoise had been, which was very confusing indeed. Somewhere I've got this photograph, but I cannot possibly, for the life of me, work out how I could have a perfectly reasonably sharply focused set of feet in furry slippers, I seem to remember, but absolutely no recognisable trace of tortoise other than aforesaid smear. She was a weird one, this tortoise. In later life, when indeed we left the house and Jess was forced to emigrate to Jersey, we could not leave her in that back garden, not for any reasons other of sentimentality particularly, but I don't think the owners the new owners would want to have this by then remarkably large tortoise sitting in the garden. We had found out something about Jess at this time, and this discovery was part of the reason for her emigration. She was taken by my mother to the local Chelonian group, who are people who quite like, presumably they're called Chelonia, tortoises. And Jess was discovered to be a Mount Olympus style tortoise who lived at the tree line of said mount. And that's not a particularly large area. Marginata, I think it was her name. Incredibly rare. And protected. And at about that time, the importation and indeed the sale of tortoises had been quite for some time long banned. And we'd had her in the garden for 20 years. And she'd eaten large quantities of things and grown. We guessed, we joked, we suggested she was indeed a Galapagos-style tortoise on the way to being gigantic. As it turned out, she was as rare as a Galapagos tortoise. Now, this is bizarre, is it not? That you could go to an Ealing pet shop, a completely usual sort of pet shop, and buy a totally unusual tortoise. Unfortunately, at about that time, it probably was usual, which is why they were endangered. We took Jess to Jersey Zoo, which was then called Jersey Zoo. It's now called the Durrell Centre. They have a dodo as a sort of a pet symbol stuck in their front door, and they've got large cages, areas for the purpose of holding and breeding tortoises. And Jess was ensconced in one of those. And before particularly long at all, she started breeding. And she came out with a large number of eggs. And out of those large number of eggs came a similarly large number of small hedgehogs, tortoises. And each one of them was well and survived and was considered to be quite an extension to the number of the said tortoises that were alive on the planet. She, all by her little self, so we were told, stopped her entire species being considered to be endangered. This is a story that I think was worthy of calling my company, if such it is, a tortoise name. But that isn't the only reason. Once I had left the family home, and Jess was still stumbling about in the back garden, I was down one tortoise. I got another one. I called her Brunhilde, and I stuck her in a background of my new place, which is also in Ealing. Brunhilde was not a particularly loud tortoise, although she did make some strange noises, I seem to remember, but she was an excellent climber. And tortoises, to my surprise, are renowned for their climbing abilities, which is presumably how they managed to get halfway up the side of Mount Olympus. But This tortoise wasn't aware she was nowhere near a mountain, but somehow or another managed to get out of a garden which had 8-foot-high brick walls around it. A good trick. I found out how she managed to continually escape one day, because I found her climbing the tree. A tree that was growing at a slant against the wall. She'd used it as a ramp and had climbed straight up. And I saw her eye to eye on the top of the wall, having just got off the branch, which is a bizarre thing. It's not where you expect to find a tortoise after sort of skirting around the garden and looking under trees and branches and bushes and bits of something else. But no, there she was. So I was impressed. The previous occasions when she had run away, somebody brought her back. We don't know where she went after she presumably had managed to get off the other side of the wall that I found her on the top of. Eventually, though, the poor creature also vanished. We had a tortoise who went away, hid, and the wonderful little nest that I'd made for her got used by a mother cat and filled the thing with kittens, which was most unfair. I think I've spoken of that before, and somebody's here to speak of something else. The door had just rung to tell me that a plumber who was lost was looking for a leak, but it wasn't in this building, so he's gone off somewhere else to find somebody else who's got a leak, so that's all right. Anyway, I found a large number of kittens, and I think I spoke of those somewhere else. Our tortoise, my experiences of tortoises, extends slightly, because I went, after having moved away from the home and indeed the garden that had Brunhilde in it, to various other places, but occasionally went to Jersey and had a look at Jess. She was very good at knocking her suitors onto their backs. Now, if you imagine the shape of a tortoise, resting it on its back would be a particularly difficult position for a tortoise to get back from. And when she didn't want to be mated with, that's what she did with her suitors. And there were quite a number of tortoises lying on their backs all around them, which is a bizarre sight. With this small car-sized tortoise running around with some much smaller male tortoises spinning slowly on their tops is almost comical, but it's not a very fast joke. She never did anything particularly quickly apart from avoid photographs. I managed to take photographs of her there. Her massive speed seems to have diminished somewhat by then. And I think that's about the end of that story. Save to say that one occasion we went back to Jersey to go and have a look for Jess, and she had gone. Quite a number of her offspring were still there, but she had departed. She'd been sold. She'd gone on to a breeder's somewhere else on the planet, because there's no need to have an endangered species in your property, in the zoo itself. But why we weren't told was a bit sad. It would have been nice to have been able to say goodbye or to trace her in some way. But if you came across a marginata tortoise from the tree line of Mount Olympus, say hello, Jess, and if she bites your toe, you'll know it's her. I felt guilty. I couldn't just send you exactly the same thing that you had a year ago, so I'm going to re-record Computers, Why Bother? Reminiscences of Our Times, an introduction to the future from the past. Why would anyone want their own computer? I asked about 40 years ago. For that matter, who would ever even want to use one? I asked myself these questions many years ago, and my answers were no idea, not me, and that's for sure. My dislike of computers was all down to the fact that, at the time, I hated maths, and so I avoided anything to do with it at all costs. My reasoning went that as computers do lots of maths and do it very fast, I should avoid computers like the plague. Number crunching, be it a bank or in an office, seemed an utterly pointless and thankless existence. In those distant days, avoiding computers was a simple task of not going near one. I then worked in broadcast television, the BBC, and it looked as if I would have had to go a long way before computers would ever cross my path. I had joined the BBC in 1978, and, like every prospective technical trainee, I spent a good part of my life attempting to survive the rigours of their gruelling Wood Norton training camp. Set in the otherwise beautiful Vale of Evesham, Wood Norton was the place where people were tested almost to destruction, termination in BBC internal parlance. It was also where the not-quite-dead lived on for a few years in a sort of half-life as lecturers. My deep dislike of the place is possibly genetic, as my father had already been through the several compulsory multi-week ordeals as part of his induction to the BBC, and may well have passed on his loathing of such places to me at my birth. The place was, and up until fairly recently still was, a residential training camp. It has recently shut. I have nightmares of it to this day. The now, I think, finally demolished ex-army hut accommodation blocks were so bad that Auntie, the BBC, could use them, and did indeed use them, in a TV programme as a setting for a prison camp. They had to be improved, though. The filming was done over a weekend when the internees, students like me, were let free to wreak havoc in the country. Sadly, after the filming, the TV crew removed the benches and curtains that they had added in order to make the place look depressing enough to be a prison. The views were Wood Norton's saving grace. They were always wonderful. They kept me sane, as did recordings of Beethoven's string quartets. It was on a clear, crisp day, much like the ones of those which may have dawned over aerodromes during the Battle of Britain, that I spoke to the man who changed my life. It was his job to talk. He was a lecturer. He told me, I don't remember why, that he had once made a mistake and was still paying for it. He related sadly that in his distant past he had dutifully learned all there was to know about the thermionic valve, which was, at that time, the high-tech of his day. In the pursuit of good job prospects, he had reached the point where his knowledge could not be bettered. Sadly for him, the world all too suddenly changed. The invention of the transistor had at first looked to be no threat to valve technology, as valves were being used everywhere, in everything, even in space. He had thought that there would always be good jobs for someone who could use valves to good effect, so he sat on his laurels, perhaps even polishing them a bit from time to time while the transistor revolution took off. By the time he noticed that the writing had been on the wall for so long that new writing had been put on top of it and the wall knocked down and rebuilt a few times, the integrated circuit had been born. His outdated knowledge was still encyclopedic when he met me, but long before then my teacher had realized there was no option but to dump his much-loved valve and start learning again. Unfortunately for him, he had left it too late to really match the cutting edge once more. No matter how well his undimmed brain dealt with the new technology, he knew he would always be at least 2 steps behind everyone else. The best job he could get was as a teacher. The moral of this story soon became clear. He knew of my dislike of mindless number-crunching maths machines and told me his story to try and stop me going the same way he did. I had to learn the new technology, even if I didn't like the look of it at first. Keep up with the new or get buried with the old, he probably said. A very gloomy thought, but one on which I acted. Time moved on. I passed my BBC engineering exams and finally managed by dint of that to stay working at the BBC in London. It was there and then that the computer stopped being a job description and started being a thing on a desk attached to a telly. Way back in 1985 or so, when a small floppy disk measured 5¼ inches and stored 400 kilobytes, which was a lot, I was already well into my second computer. The first had been, and to some extent was last time I saw it, a home-built but not home-brew CompuKit UK 101. If you've never heard of it, go to the Science Museum. It was a bag of bits which, when assembled, turned into a fully working BASIC-based wonder machine with 4 whole kilobytes of memory. It had also the option of an add-on chip which provided full word processing facilities if you didn't break its legs off pushing it into the motherboard. The chip had a program that ran on an 8K read-only memory and did everything anyone could want. By then I knew what ROM meant, but I didn't believe I'd ever have anything interesting to write, so I didn't expect to use that aspect of the computer very much. Anyway, to my delight, no legs broke as I pushed it into the board, and the machine worked first time. Amazingly, I quickly found I could do so much else with it. Firstly, I could show it off to people. Secondly, I could use it to play games and not have to pay for them by putting a coin in a slot. Often the UK 101 was the first computer my audience had ever seen, and a lot of admiration could be had just by owning one. To be able to say that I'd made it was a bonus. None of that cut much ice at all at work, however. There, at the BBC, everyone had built their own computer, so I had to show a degree of proficiency with it to be able to show myself in public at all. Not everyone had the same machine, though. Some had a NASCOM 1. Other people had the same as me. The richest had some sort of Apple, Tandy or IBM thing. I never liked talking to them. I didn't understand a word they said, and it made me feel inferior. So I kept within my little group, where we talked happily in our UK 101 jargon. Microsoft didn't really exist then. This did not last for long. The BBC had great plans for the future. One day, standing outside a meeting room above Ealing Broadway Station, where BBC Enterprises once was, I got a glimpse of the first BBC Micro. I was very impressed. For a start, it was a British colour machine, not an American colour one without a U. It had lots of memory and said New Brain on the box. I never saw it again. When the BBC Model A came out, it was made by Acorn, the Atom people. I had heard of the Atom. It had been no match for the New Brain I had seen, but as soon as the new Acorn BBC computer was available, it trounced all that had come before it, and so I joined the queue. As a member of BBC staff, I had expected, hoped, even counted on being able to wangle a good deal on the first machines. No joy. We all had to pay the full price. Never mind, at least I had one. The new machine was also colour. It had a 16K memory. It had built-in sound and could be easily expanded. Rapidly I found out that expansion was obligatory. There was no real choice. Already things were moving too fast to stay still. Initially, I thought there was no need for more memory if all I wanted to do was write a few letters or play some very simple teletext graphics-type games. But all of a sudden, magazines were published, advertising all the new programs, not programs with 2 M's, that I could read and type in line by line. Each of these needed lots of RAM for pretty pictures on the screen. The better the picture, the bigger the memory, so I bought some more chips, plugged them in, and called the box a BBC Model B, which it was not. In those days, the only way to get around having to type in a program every time you wanted the machine to do anything was either buy it ready typed and stored on an ordinary cassette tape, or type it in yourself and save it to tape and keep it for next time. This saving and loading from tape was a pain of the highest order. Although the BBC computer worked much more reliably than the UK 101 ever had, or Sinclair computer ever would, it was still a long wait watching the loading banner before anything much would happen. Sometimes a program maker would give me something to look at while the rest of the data loaded, but the extra wait before the program proper would start, due to the fact that it had loaded that waiting banner, was very irritating. Also, it took just one tape glitch for the transfer to stop, and the machine would display a message asking for the tape to be rewound in an attempt at fixing the problem. I yearned for a floppy disk drive. A true Model B, bought from a shop, had a disk interface already partly installed. My machine, which had been an A, just by getting more memory, didn't include the disk upgrade kit, and so wouldn't do the job until I added that too. It took some time before I could relax to the sound of tiny little clunks from a massive 10-megabyte hard drive, but the effort was well worth it. I still didn't have a lot of real intrinsic use for the machine, but my organic brain had started to do things that I'd always thought were far beyond it. In retrospect, this was the best part of computing for me. Not what I could do with a computer, but what I could do with the brain in my head after having learned how to use a computer. For example, I found that with a bit of effort I could solve the Rubik Cube, which was a complex toy of the time. Having proved that I could concentrate for long periods on relatively dry computing subjects with the hope of something good at the end, I learned that I could do the same thing in real life. For another and more important thing, I had passed my final set of BBC exams by using that mode of thought, which I had feared I would fail. On top of the fun of computing, it also gave me a subject on which to talk to people who I didn't know, and it was something to do when nothing was on the telly. Note, the internet sort of existed, mostly as news groups, but the World Wide Web, at least as we know it today, most certainly did not. Before the dawn of the BBC Micro, I had taken my UK 101 to work, so that I could get paid for watching telly and use a computer at the same time. Perhaps that's why I didn't get promoted. I typed out a program called Cells and Serpents, one of the first Dungeons and Dragons role-playing games for a computer. It was very easy to adapt and great fun to play around with, although not all that great as an actual game. That was the essence of computing for me, the simple fun of thinking what to make it do and trying to make it do it, and then playing the game to see that, after all my hard work, any of it had been worth doing. Lovely. There was no need for me to bring a BBC computer into work. Soon almost every room at Television Centre had one sitting in a corner. These machines were not there to gather dust. They were workhorses, there to do a real job of keeping records of edit sessions, generating clocks, even the putting subtitles onto CFAX broadcasts. Sometimes the CFAX screens themselves were created with them, probably always. More than once I transmitted a What's On Next caption to a satellite-based TV system using a BBC B to generate a screen full of teletext graphics. That was fun. By then I was heavily into writing. Nothing intended for reading, just diary-type notes for fun. That sort of thing was not expected at the Beeb, and there were not many word processors available, at least in the engineering areas, so I wrote one. As a program, it was rubbish, but it worked. The addition of the ability to write words as well as programs had the unexpected side effect in my brain that it helped me develop many aspects of my powers of deduction, reasoning, thought, and inventiveness, all rather handy things to get better at. In short, computing gave me more than just something to do. It gave me the ability and the reason to bother to do it. As my self-confidence grew, so did my abilities. The uncomplaining nature of my dumb assistant let me learn what I wanted to learn at my own speed, where and when I wanted to learn it. Perfection. Now I am a lecturer myself, teaching computing. It's the best job I've ever had, apart from writing articles and being an actor. Funny old world.